Hello, everyone. Welcome to the conference Sapienza in Trance, Healing, Cooperation, and Imagination. I'm thrilled to introduce the keynote speaker for today's session for this conference, Professor Thomas Csordas, distinguished professor in the Department of Anthropology and founding director of the Global Health Program at the University of California, San Diego. His work spans from medical and psychological anthropology to the anthropology of religion and globalization. The cultural phenomenology and the paradigm of embodiment he proposed have informed study on the body, the self, imagination, and health. He has conducted ethnographic fieldwork among charismatic Catholics, Navajo Indians, adolescent psychiatric patients in New Mexico, Catholic exorcists in the United States and Italy, and providers of care for refugees, asylum seekers on the US-Mexico border. He has addressed the therapeutic process in religious healing, ritual language and creativity, sensory imagery, self-transformation, techniques of the body, and the understanding of lived experience. In this keynote, is going to tackle a question debated in the studies of possession since the work of Erika Bourguignon, as the title of his lecture asks, is a possessed person in trance? Is an entranced person self-aware? Trance states have indeed been used as a variable to draw different sets of categorizations in the literature on the phenomenon of spirit manifestation around the world. As ethnographers working on trance states in ritual healing, the question of the presence of or absence of trance, as much as self-awareness during the phenomenon, fosters discussions around the self, authority, trust, the expectation around and the perceived authenticity of the manifestation of spirits in ritual healing. Drawing upon his latest research on the practice of Roman Catholic exorcism, Thomas Csordas is going to point to the therapeutic value of the process of entering and leaving the state of trance within ritual performance, which is definitely a pivotal question in this conference. So please join me in welcoming Professor Thomas Csordas.
Thank you very much, Emily. Let me make sure that you can see everyone. There we go. So it's an absolute delight to be here with you at La Sapienza and participating in this conference. When Emily invited me to speak on the theme of Sapienza in trance, my thoughts went immediately to the anthropological work on altered states of consciousness by one of my teachers, Erika Bourguignon, who made an important distinction among possession trance and possession trance. Erika observed that across the world's cultures, the term possession could be used to describe a relation between a person and an entity such as a spirit, ancestor, deity, or demon. This relation can be one of control and domination, patronage and protection, devotion and consecration, whether or not it involves penetration of the entity into the person's body, and it can be episodic or ongoing. Trance describes not a relation, but a state of consciousness distinct from the everyday, mundane, quotidian consciousness of the taken-for-granted life world. Trance can vary in the method of induction, such as hypnosis, meditation, music, or drugs, in degree ranging from the person being oblivious of their surroundings to being mildly distracted, and with respect to whether it is a result of absorption or dissociation. Possession trance, combining both of these, is the intersection in lived experience between the relation of possession and the state of trance. Cultural and religious understandings of possession trance often presume the displacement of self and consciousness by the possessing entity. But aside from the ideology that a person is expected to be absent or elsewhere while possessed, it is entirely possible for a person to retain some degree of self-awareness during possession trance. With respect to the questions I posed in my title, then, is a possessed person in trance? The answer is not necessarily. Is an entranced person self-aware? It depends on the kind of trance and the ideology of trance. Yet these are not the only relevant questions. When we consider possession trance in a specific religious context, we can ask how the effects of possession trance reverberate through the structure of consciousness of a group, community, or religious system. We can ask if demonic possession trance is therapeutic or symptomatic, that is, whether it is an element of the healing process or an aspect of affliction. We can ask for insights into how the religious experience and ritual practice of possession trance are predicated on and performatively contribute to the cultural constitution of self and bodily existence. My talk today is about possession by demons, not deities, and I will first observe that a great deal can be told about a people from the nature of their demons. We can take this in a metaphorical sense, where demons stand for ideas that haunt, conflicts that vex, troubles that recur in a patterned way, or destructive and self-destructive tendencies identifiable within culture. We can also take it in a literal sense, where demons are evil spirits that afflict humans with an agency of their own and with malicious intent, causing illness and anguish. This literal sense holds in the case of many cultures and religions around the world. Today, I'll examine a situation and a set of practices in contemporary society which take the idea of demons very literally. The situation is that of the Roman Catholic Church, and the practices are those associated with exorcism, the relief of affliction attributed to the extraordinary action of diabolical spirits. Exorcism is a formal rite that must be carried out by an ordained priest with express permission of his bishop, and only under the moral certainty that the afflicted person is under the influence of demonic spirit. The ethnographic context of what I have to say is the contemporary resurgence of exorcism within the church. My research is based on a comparative study in which I interviewed exorcists, possessed people, and mental health professionals in Italy and the United States. My talk today is a preview of a forthcoming longer work in which I'll discuss the institutional infrastructure of exorcism today, the mentality and ethos of exorcists, the performance of the rite based on observation of specific instances, the relation between psychiatric disorder and demonic affliction, and the narrative profiles of lived experience among possessed people I had the opportunity to interview. Here, I'll follow the conference theme to examine trance as a metaphor for the structure of consciousness created by exorcism as a ritual practice and religious imagination, as well as a literal description of the possessed person's lived experience within the rite. Because it's indeed the case that one could compare cultures by comparing their demons and how these demons affect and afflict people, a first step is to start from the broadest understanding of demons and narrow the discussion to the Catholic case, so as to best situate its particular mode of understanding demons and practicing exorcism. Religions often distinguish between deities and demons, the former being of a higher nature and the latter of a lower nature, the former being benevolent and the latter evil. Not all deities are always and all good, however, and not all demons are in their essential character evil spirits. Nature spirits, animal spirits, ancestral spirits are other types of spiritual beings that may be recognized and may manifest varying degrees of malevolence and benevolence at various times. The ambiguous nature of some spirits in this sense leads to the fact that in some cultural settings in which they produce suffering, anguish, distress, or illness, they are expelled or cast out, while in others, where their effects are equally unpleasant, the common strategy is to come to terms with them, developing a relation in which they are propitiated and appeased, and may in fact become sponsors or protectors. The strategy of expulsion is called exorcism, while the strategy of accommodation is called adorcism, a term coined by Belgian anthropologist Luc Deutsch. In the Christian cosmology and ontology, demons are angels who have fallen by virtue of rejecting God. The rejection is extreme and irreversible, such that in the process, their nature has become irredeemably evil. They cannot achieve salvation even in the unlikely case they want to repent. For them, it's too late. There's no accommodation with such beings. When they take hold of a person, they must be exorcised. Exorcists trace their practice directly to biblical accounts of Jesus casting out evil spirits. Significantly, in the hegemonic patriarchal discourse of Catholic exorcism, the existence of all other spirits that might be outside the hierarchical authority of the Abrahamic divinity is suspect. Deities of other traditions, animal spirits, the spirits of dead humans that present themselves in exorcism are, from this perspective, just as likely to be demons under the dominion of Satan, who in their deceitful nature are disguising themselves as something else. This position challenges the ontological and cosmological validity of all other religions, reducing the spiritual world to the black and white terms of good and evil, and serving the rhetorical goal of hegemonic patriarchy. While the Abrahamic religions are understood to share a conception of demonic evil, in a stance reminiscent of the period of European colonial conquest, the spirits and deities of other traditions are understood to be aspects of demonic evil themselves. In this respect, they are assimilated to an exceedingly broad category of the occult that includes all manner of practices ranging from non-Christian world religions to overt Christian-based Satanism, from the casual use of Ouija boards to the following of vaguely New Age self-help figures such as Oprah Winfrey. One very thoughtful exorcist, struggling to be as fair-minded as possible, said that if yoga postures and exercises were performed purely as physical acts and without any accompaniment by spiritual precepts or symbols, they could be acceptable. But otherwise, they were inevitably dangerous opportunities for demons to gain purchase on practitioners. From this standpoint, the study of comparative religion from within the exorcistic Weltanschauung would be the study of the many possible variations of demonic activity. And I have to say that practically everything that we're studying during this conference would therefore be defined as demonic or potentially demonic. The current resurgence of exorcism has a number of sources, not least among which are the continued repercussions of the Second Vatican Council in the 1960s, the post-Cold War nostalgia for a world defined in terms of good versus evil, and reaction to the continued scandal over clerical sexual abuse. Casting all of this under the sign of simple conflict between God and Satan offers a possibility of certainty where there is none otherwise. Institutionally, one temporal marker of this resurgence is the founding in Italy in 1994 of the International Association of Exorcists, and its formal recognition in 2014 as a private association of the Christian faithful by the Congregation for the Clergy within the Vatican. Another temporal marker is the revision of the 1614 Roman ritual version of the rite of exorcism and publication of this revision in 1999. It is of historical significance in this respect that in the wake of the original rite's appearance, in 1624, Cardinal Federico Borromeo, Archbishop of Milan, published his Parallela Cosmographica de Sede et Apparitionibus Demonum, a significant Catholic treatise on demonic activity. This work examined the distribution of demonic activity according to night and day, north and south, in relation to the four elements and across continents, in individual possessed people, as well as distinguishing between demonic activity and superstition. Borromeo's work was never translated from Latin to Italian until 2001, 2 years after the rite was reformulated and updated, and was then re-released in 2012 as the exorcism resurgence gained momentum. The publication and republication of Apparitionibus Demonum temporally spans and leaps over the Enlightenment, with its claim to contemporary relevance marking a milestone in our contemporary age of re-enchantment of the world. A brief story will put a point on the issue of enlightenment and re-enchantment. At the end of an interview with two Catholic exorcists in a northern Italian city, I engaged in the ethnographic politeness of asking whether they had any questions to ask in reciprocation for all those I had asked them. Responding to the inquiry about where I taught, I said, I taught cultural anthropology at the University of California, San Diego. This was not quite a sufficient answer, and one of the priests followed up by saying, but marrying faith to reason, or only reason, you wouldn't be a man of the Enlightenment by any chance. I can still hear this query, for at that moment, I realized that although in my intellectual world, the Enlightenment was an intellectual movement of more than 300 years ago, the main issues of which had largely been settled, this was not the case for my interlocutors. For them, the Enlightenment was an open question, and the dialectic of faith and reason was a lively issue, directly relevant to their practice as exorcists. In this respect, the resurgence of exorcism is not a pre-Enlightenment anachronism, but an element in a global movement of re-enchantment that creates an ontological rift in contemporary civilization. It likewise suggests an ontological rift within the church itself, evident in the following exchange. In 2019, Father Arturo Sosa, the Superior General of the Jesuit Order, stated that the devil, and I quote, exists as the personification of evil in different structures, but not in persons, because is not a person, is a way of acting evil. Symbols are part of reality, and the devil exists as a symbolic reality, not as a personal reality. End of quote. The very next day, the International Association of Exorcists responded with a press release calling Sosa's remarks, and I quote again, grave and confusing, because the real existence of the devil as a personal subject who thinks and acts and has made the choice of rebellion against God is a truth of faith that has always been part of Christian doctrine. End quote. This stance constitutes an epistemological, cosmological, and ontological intervention that claims empirical knowledge of demonic activity, the ultimacy of divine command and dominion over the force of diabolically evil spirits and entities at large in the world, and the essential role of their sacred rite in fostering the being and becoming of humans, as well as in consolidating the patriarchal hegemony over those humans. The state of enchantment fostered by contemporary exorcists is a way of being in the world for the exorcists, a structure of consciousness that envelops their practice and the experience of those who are defined as possessed and in need of their ministry. Since we've already invoked the relationship between enlightenment and enchantment, and thereby the problematic of faith and reason, let's now address another aspect of the exorcistic structure of consciousness. It's all part of a structure of trance in a very large sense. This is the relation between mental illness and possession at the intersection of psychiatry and religion. Somewhat ironically, in the present case, this intersection is rendered problematic not because exorcists reinterpret mental illness in demonological terms, but precisely by the church's complete acceptance of psychiatry. That is, mental illness must be professionally ruled out prior to recognizing a problem as due to demonic affliction. And therefore, by definition, the standard formulation of ethnopsychiatry that recognizes psychotherapy and religious healing as equivalent or alternative ways of addressing affliction cannot be applied within the logic of the religious system. Even in a case in which psychiatric disorder is diagnosed, there may be a surplus, sovrapillu, that goes beyond what can be accounted for in medical terms, and that can be identified as demonic. Moreover, since evil spirits are clever and skilled liars, they may disguise their presence by mimicking the symptoms of mental illness as a way of self-concealment. This is quite the opposite of the Enlightenment medical interpretation that religion misrecognizes symptoms of psychiatric disorder as demonic possession. It's not only the case that exorcists consult with psychiatrists and other mental health professionals. What is more intriguing is the existence of psychiatrists who are themselves observant Catholics and who assist and consult with priests as part of a team and whose professional stance is that psychiatric disorder and demonic affliction have the same ontological and existential status as sources of human suffering. This stance bestows an entirely unique sense to the enterprise of differential diagnosis. In the United States, there are two psychiatrists whose work in support of exorcists has sufficiently high profile to have had an impact on professional and educated lay discourse. One is on the East Coast, one is on the West. One is male, the other female. Both are practicing psychiatrists with connection to hospitals and medical schools. I'll briefly outline their positions, one articulated in an address to a Catholic medical society and one in an article in a leading Catholic magazine. Both present a case of possession determined by them and the priests to be authentic. And our purpose here is to get a glimpse of the thought process that comes into play and the manner in which the possession enters into diagnostic discourse. Dr. Gallagher's case is of a middle-aged, self-supporting Caucasian woman who was raised Catholic but no longer practiced. She sought out exorcism of her own accord, an act that exorcists often suspect may be motivated by attention-seeking rather than suffering. She was, in the doctor's words, an avowed and prominent Satanist who displayed special occult powers. The psychiatrist reported that she would enter a trance state during which she uttered threats, taunts, and scatological language in a radically altered tone of voice, exhibited psychokinesis and knowledge that she had no way of having acquired, and that during exorcism sessions, the room would unexplainably alternate between being extremely cold and hot, while the voice would speak in foreign languages and the woman would exhibit enormous strength, levitate, and react negatively to holy water, but not to unblessed water. She underwent 2 series of exorcism sessions, which were discontinued during to what the doctor called her hesitations, though he judged that the sessions were helpful but have not yet resolved the matter of the possession. The psychiatrist makes it clear, however, that he is not concerned with exorcism per se, but with counterfeits of true possession constituted by psychiatric disorders. The case opens with a definitive statement that it is truly an obvious example of a genuine attack, at least to an objective observer. And he concludes with the declaration that assaults by the devil, like genuine miracles, are rare but quite real scientific facts. He states definitively that she was in no way psychotic. In fact, she was consistently logical, highly intelligent, and even quite engaging at times, despite her obvious turmoil. Again, he determines that despite her trances and professed inability to recall what happened in them, the diagnosis of dissociative identity disorder was implausible because of the paranormal phenomena that accompanied them. The emphasis was that the major features distinguishing such a case from mental disorder are the clear presence of such paranormal phenomena and a sui generis distinct group of features that constitute a syndrome inexplicable on psychiatric or medical grounds. The core of the psychiatrist's argument is that psychopathology can counterfeit possession. 3 diagnostic categories in particular, he thought, are most relevant: psychoses such as schizophrenia and bipolar disorder, personality or character disorders such as borderline personality disorder, and histrionic personality disorder or dissociative identity disorder, along with other diagnoses formerly too broadly labeled hysteric, that may include a sense of excitement or self-importance, suggestibility, and manipulativeness. The point is that the vast majority of cases that can easily be misconstrued as demonic attack have an obvious psychiatric explanation. Psychiatrists frequently and commonly encounter patients with explicit religious or demonic claims, yet it is incorrect in this view to conclude that all such cases are a reflection of psychiatric pathology. In other words, in this cultural logic, rigorous diagnostic work and the understanding that possession is exceedingly rare makes authentic cases all the more authentic. Dr. Hunt, the other psychiatrist, opens her address to the Catholic Medical Association by reading a biblical passage that distinguishes among the possessed, lunatics, and paralytics healed by Jesus, going on to refer to the definite preternatural signs that indicate the phenomenon cannot be explained by medicine. She outlines various degrees of demonic affliction or influence, common vulnerabilities such as engagement in occult or New Age practices, habitual mortal sin, victimization and trauma, and curses, and the classic signs of possession. She then offers an exemplary, stylized, composite case study of a 25-year-old female who is active in her local parish and who has experienced many years of anxiety that have become inexplicably exacerbated, along with spells of agitated violence and verbal abuse at home with her family. The psychiatrist, speaking to an audience of other physicians, presents her experience accompanying an exorcist on a home visit in the capacity of a psychiatric consultant charged with making a differential diagnosis. She focuses on describing the violent episodes along with symptoms such as nightmares, flashbacks, absences, losing track of time, and depression, a history of sexual abuse, and the fact that the young woman was seeing a therapist. In the same paragraph, and with equivalent emphasis, she observes that the young woman has been dating a non-Catholic man, has under his influence become engaged in New Age beliefs, and has not fully participated in the sacraments for the last 2 years. During the home visit, the young woman is agitated, with face contorted while trying to kick and bite her brothers who are struggling to restrain her. A very dark, low voice coming out of her accuses the priest of being afraid, like when he witnessed a murder as a teenager, indicating knowledge about the priest's life that the young woman could not have known naturally. As the priest prayed, the manifestations got worse, and she became ferocious when he sprinkled her with holy water. As she drifted in and out of consciousness, she said weakly in her own voice, "Please help me." And when the priest asked what was her favorite prayer, the group responded to her request by repeatedly reciting the Hail Mary. She calmed down and fell asleep. Paralyzed when she awakened, her family took her to the hospital emergency room, having received prudent instructions from the exorcism team to present the situation as a violent and aggressive episode of a type that had been recurring for almost a year, rather than as a possible demonic possession. Follow-up revealed a distant family history of bipolar disorder and schizophrenia, but the patient's medical health had been good except for the spells of agitation. She had a full neurological workup in the emergency room setting, and nothing was found. The psychiatrist concluded that the paralysis fit a conversion disorder. The woman continued seeing a therapist for PTSD and a major depressive disorder with psychotic features, and was started on an SSRI medication with consideration of adding an atypical neuroleptic depending on her response. The case was then brought to the bishop, and based on the supernatural features, superhuman strength, knowledge of hidden things, the bishop authorized an exorcism. The psychiatrist summarized as follows. At first exorcism, the symptoms of the conversion disorder completely disappeared and never came back. She was also freed from many other manifestations. 2 more rites of exorcism, she was completely freed from the manifestations. She continued to work through PTSD issues, continued her medications, returned to her faith life, returned to the sacraments, frequent reception of the sacraments, and was able to continue to obtain her teaching degree, and is now involved in the Catholic Church as a catechist. This is a miracle. Those who recognize conversion disorder as a contemporary term for what was once called hysteria would also likely recognize the interpretation that what the religious mentality regards as possession is better described in psychiatric terms as hysteria. And in this light, Dr. Hunt's account appears almost ironic. From an ethnographic standpoint, what is significant is the recognition of simultaneous psychiatric and spiritual issues, and the addition of supernatural, preternatural, or paranormal features that in the indigenous view, the indigenous in this case being Roman Catholic, cannot be accounted for in the medical or psychiatric vocabulary. Now, I've described these discussions by Catholic psychiatrists in terms of their reasoning about differential diagnosis that includes demonic affliction among the issues to rule in or rule out. There is an ontological twist insofar as the presence of demons and demonic activity opens up a space in reality, not so much in the sense of making space for an element of the irrational, but laying claim to a place within medical and scientific rationality. It is not that the symptoms of mental illness are misconstrued as manifestations of the demonic. If both mental illness and demonic affliction are ontologically real, the way is open for a complex set of possibilities. Mental illness counterfeits or mimics the demonic. The reverse can also be the case, however, and the psychiatrist cites the prominent exorcist Gabriel Amort and Francesco Bamonte to the effect that, and I quote, an extraordinary action of the devil can be present simultaneously with, exacerbate, or imitate a psychological problem or mental illness. The psychiatrist states that demonic affliction can become part of an illness too. It may not cause the illness, but demons have been known to hide under illnesses. Simulation of psychiatric symptoms in this way are a way for inherently deceitful demons to disguise themselves or hide their presence. For the clinicians as for the exorcist, this ontological space leads to a phenomenological modulation of attention to distinguish empirically what in one frame might be a psychiatric symptom and in another a demonic manifestation. Dr. Hunt reports that if a patient was hearing voices, it could matter whether those voices were experienced as coming from outside themselves or from inside their head, sometimes inside their person. If the former was the case, that they were coming from outside, there was more likely that the symptom was one of psychosis. But if the latter, coming from inside, it's relatively more likely that an evil spirit is within the person. Internal demonic voices are continuous with the demonic voice that can emanate audibly from the afflicted in the ritual setting, speaking in a way distinct from the person's characteristic voice and addressing not only the afflicted, but the exorcist and others present. In this way, exorcism entails an alternative hermeneutic of the clinical, a semiosis that includes a spiritual and preternatural plane of reference, as well as the phenomenological immediacy of empirical observation. This goes beyond ontological enchantment to the positing in practice of intertwined states of consciousness defined by possession and psychopathology. So with the background of an overall enchantment that is part of our contemporary society, and this particular structure of consciousness that juxtaposes this, the state of possession with mental illness, let's turn to the structure of consciousness in the possessed person and the question of possession trance per se. At issue are two elements: the occurrence of spontaneous behaviors defined as demonic manifestations, and the degree of self-awareness reported by the possessed person during the rite. This takes us to the level of understanding the rite at the level of its actual performance, which requires attention to details of language and vocalization, gesture and gesticulation, proximity and distance among persons, violence and tranquility. The exorcism rite is a drama of free will and agency, played out simultaneously on a cosmological plane and in experiential immediacy. This is framed by a very precise semiotic relation among person, demon, and demonic manifestations on the one hand, and between exorcist, demon, and demonic manifestations on the other. Demonic manifestations are elements of behavior that may occur in everyday life, but are most explicitly pronounced in sessions of exorcism in which the demons are challenged by the exorcist and respond through the medium of spontaneous bodily enactments. These can be a yawn, a burp, a hiccup, twitch, jerk, vomit. can be the appearance of a thought, image, or sensation, such as heat or cold, pain or inner bodily movement, or other sensory alteration. It can be a grimace, a smirk, a glower, a contortion, convulsion, arching of the back, kicking or flailing, writhing on the floor. It can be spitting, smashing, or throwing something, hitting or attacking someone. It can be growling, screaming, cursing, mocking, laughing derisively, lying, insulting, blaspheming, threatening, boasting, answering an exorcist's query, or challenging the exorcist. The manifestations that characterize enactment of a possession crisis during the session of exorcism are typically interspersed with periods in which the afflicted person evidently speaks or reports experience in his or her accustomed voice. Most importantly, from the standpoint of defining the manifestations as concrete experience of the divine and demonic, their immediacy is embedded in their spontaneity, and patients report that they are virtual automatisms. The experiences may also be responses to the actions of the exorcist, rather than completely spontaneous, and indeed the priests try to elicit responses and even provoke the spirit in order to determine its identity or find its vulnerabilities. Utterance of a particular saint's name during the recitation of the litany, the ringing of liturgical bells. Bells are understood to scare away and chase away demons. And the periodic ringing of bells from church steeples is understood to traditionally have this purpose. There can be the application to the body of sacramental substances such as blessed salt, holy water, or christened oil, and contact with a crucifix, rosary, or the priest's liturgical stole are examples of such external prompts. Bodily immediacy is also highlighted in the experience of others' presence. For example, a Catholic clinical psychologist asked me after a session what it was like for me, meaning specifically whether I detected any immediate bodily signs in myself, such as my hair standing on end, which could be criterial for sensing the presence of evil. The manifestations, but more particularly the immediate experience of manifestations, is a critical site of bodily alterity at which the drama of free will and agency is enacted. The manifestations are spontaneous behaviors, but the point is not to read the manifestation as a text, but to interpret the spontaneity per se as a function of embodiment. Elsewhere, I've argued that the fundamental alterity structured into our bodily existence is the phenomenological kernel of religion. The fact of raw existence that we can be both subject and object to ourselves, to both touch ourselves and feel ourselves being touched as we do so, is the originary experience of otherness that is culturally elaborated as religious experience. The behaviors identified as demonic manifestations are a vivid example of this embodied alterity being put to use in a ritual setting to serve the goals of both paternalistic therapy and patriarchal authority. One could, with some apprehension, call the manifestations automatisms in the specific sense that they occur outside of explicit intentionality, without pain or reflection, almost always in a way that is an unexpected surprise for the possessed person. The person may be observing and able to report on the behavior just as likely as they may be unaware and oblivious of what they're doing or saying. In other words, they may be conscious and self-aware just as likely as they may be in some level of absence or dissociation. Indeed, the self-aware automatism that is explicitly ego-alien serves the rhetorical and performative purpose of exorcism better than somnambulistic acting out. The problem with the term automatism is that it can be taken in the strict sense of a traumatic automatism as elaborated by Pierre Janet. Spontaneous is a weak descriptor because it lacks suddenness and surprise. Reflex doesn't work to describe this either because it's reductionistic and not adequately ego-alien. Neither term can be culturally elaborated in such a way as to problematize agency and sanctify alterity to a degree sufficient to satisfy the cosmological and ontological demands of ritual performance. Let's now take a closer look at the issue of self-awareness in the ritual setting, with two contrasting examples of possessed people describing their experience. Amelia was, pseudonym of course, Amelia was a 64-year-old married woman with 2 adult children who lived in a rural Italian village. She began her narrative with a comment that emphasized both an unsatisfying early family life and the absence of religion. She did not start going to church until she was in her 50s. Part of her experience relevant to trance within sessions of exorcism includes the following. Now, these are her words. Sometimes when the exorcist tells me to pray, I try to do it. But then the demon, intervenes and I can't do it anymore. Afterwards, he, the demon, makes you scream. I try to pray when I have a moment of coming back to consciousness, because you can feel it when, at least I think so, because there are times also in which I don't understand and I struggle. At least I think I understand, but when the other reacts, it makes you do those things that if I had to do them now, I wouldn't be able to. Sometimes I feel anger because the other one gets angry. It is not me who gets angry, but it's the other one who gets angry. And the other one is always the demon in this case. Amelia said explicitly that the experience of the devil's activity within her or in control of her is hard to explain. She offers a clear description of a murky existential oscillation between going in and out of conscious awareness, because she says you can feel it when that happens, overlaid by an alternation between understanding and not understanding what is happening, further overlaid by distinguishing between her own anger and the demon's anger, and by the drama of free will itself, as she makes the effort to pray whenever she has a moment of lucidity. Very contrasting situation was Carl, a 56-year-old white male in the United States whose family was not originally Catholic, but converted after placing their children in the parochial school system. Carl had little interest in religion till later in life when he was earning his PhD in a science field. His experience during exorcism sessions does not seem characterized by trance or dissociation. In his words, I was aware virtually all the time. Maybe some minor lapses, but those weren't all the time. Even though I was having convulsions, screaming, having fits, and so forth, inside, I wasn't particularly disturbed, wasn't particularly afraid. And I was thinking, trying to analyze the patterns of what I was seeing going on, noticing how the demons responded or didn't respond to different kinds of prayers. There might have been a couple times where I wasn't tuned in, but the notion of vanishing and losing awareness of it all was not the typical thing, certainly. In accord with his own self-description as a rational scientific thinker, he is a kind of objective observer of his own experience of spontaneous behaviors attributable to demonic activity, discerning patterns in demonic behavior without a great deal of emotion, while acknowledging moments in which he was not tuned in, as he said, to the proceedings. He made it a point to comment that the exorcist thought this degree of self-awareness was somewhat unique. Beyond the issue of spontaneous manifestations and the issue of variable self-awareness, the performative role of demons is an explicit challenge to the integrity and identity of persons in the ritual event. The demon's intent is to control the body, capture the soul, and displace the self, and it varies according to the afflicted person and their circumstances. Although they remain within the possessed person in everyday life, their presence is manifest particularly in exorcisms when they are challenged by the priest and commanded to depart. Formal demonologies are less important than how the demons work in the phenomenology of an affliction and the therapeutic process mobilized to address it. Demons are understood to be personal beings and therefore have proper names, which are sometimes recognizable from the Bible, such as Asmodeus or Lilith, who target sexuality. Demons are also organized hierarchically, so that the exorcist must expel them from weakest to strongest, such as in a case I observed when a demon called Militia Tamiel had to leave a woman along with his 6 or 7 subordinates. The exorcism can ascend hierarchically from the weakest to strongest spirits, so that the final and most difficult spirit to expel may be Satan himself. And in principle, the exorcism is concluded once he is gone. The primary rhetorical victory is to compel the demon to reveal its name through the voice of the possessed, since once named, the demon can be controlled. This vocalization may be spontaneous and without prior reflection. Responding to the exorcist's interrogation about the demon's identity and intentions is a third factor defining the possessed person's structure of consciousness. The symbolic organization of demons and their number vary in practice and play a role in the performative dynamic. Among the small cohort of people I interviewed, this ranged from a woman who had only one demon that was entirely mute, except for nonverbal vocalizations as she struggled physically, and the exorcist struggled to gain some purchase on the recalcitrant entity, to a man who claimed to have had at least 100 demons that revealed their names to him, sometimes even outside the exorcism session, which he noted down in order to convey their identities to the exorcist at their next meeting. Describing the variations from case to case in how demons behave among themselves would not likely add up to a systematic ethnographic demonology, but is relevant in the psychic and performative ritual process of each one. The priest and his helpers in the exorcism session are highly attuned to the state of the possessed person. They create an intersubjective and intercorporeal milieu that constitutes a fourth element of the afflicted person's structure of consciousness. The assistants pray and look for meaningful signs or gestures from the energumen. Energumen is the technical theological term for possessed person. The exorcist recites the formal prayers of the rite, but also improvises, and at times speaks both to the demon and to the energumen. Although the rite is scripted, there are numerous opportunities to interpolate elements, to repeat parts of the ceremony, to switch from formal prayers to interrogation of the spirit, or to conversing with the afflicted in the form of encouragement, or asking how he or she is doing and what they are feeling. Every element is open to interpretation. For example, in a session I observed in the United States, as an afflicted woman sat on a straight-backed chair in the middle of a circle of participants, she held her arms stiffly at her sides while arching her back and rolling her stomach. The lay assistants to the exorcist interpreted this as a birth trauma. I interpreted it as an experience of rape. The Catholic clinical psychologist assisting at the ceremony interpreted it as a seizure. All of these interpretations were made in the context of knowing the woman had been born as the product of a rape. In fact, she herself was aware of and trying to come to terms with this situation. The same woman described a feeling of movement from her stomach up to her throat and understood it as the demon rising and subsequently creating a spontaneous and unpleasant vocalization. Upon hearing my account of this, a colleague commented that a classic element of hysteria was the rising of the womb to the throat, clearly an interpretation from another field of semiosis, but one that overlaps with particular relevance to our previous discussion of mental health professionals called on to distinguish symptoms of pathology from manifestations of possession. I want to conclude that in the case of exorcism, the question of trance is subordinate to a ritual process that blends improvisation and liturgical protocol, automatism and intentional act, and at the same time allows variations in lived experience from one person to another, while assuring that the experience conforms to a cosmological and ontological certainty. In this context, an entire structure of consciousness is at issue, rather than the narrow question of trance per se. At the cosmological and ontological level, this entails the contemporary re-enchantment of the world, of which the resurgence of exorcism partakes. And at a more specific level of practice, the way enchantment shapes the relation between possession and psychopathology. At the phenomenological level of ritual performance, the structure of consciousness is constituted by the four features of spontaneity and automatism, self-awareness and presence, identity and alterity, and intersubjectivity and intercorporeality. To the extent that these four features constitute trance, we can say that trance is an essential feature of exorcism, both negative and symptomatic as a painful experience, and positive and therapeutic as a necessary phase of the ritual process. Again, and finally, exorcism is a drama of free will and agency. The good energumen is supposed to struggle prayerfully against the demons who impose their will and deprive her of agency. The exorcist, as the paternalistic instrument of patriarchal power, struggles in the name of Jesus to liberate the possessed person from this attempted domination. However, this liberation is for the sole purpose of allowing the exorcised person to then submit themselves completely to the deity, and ideally to attest to the deity's goodness and power by proclaiming their freedom to the world. The person is free to choose, but only between submission to God or to the devil. The rhetoric of exorcism is thus a closed circuit, and it is impossible not to wonder whether the genius of the religious system is to have created both a form of affliction and the ritual means to resolve it, such that the intertwining of paternalism and patriarchy in exorcism is, at least to some extent, an example of an immense social and cultural institution producing the problems that it then purports to ameliorate for the sake of optimizing its hold over the faithful. Thank you.
Thank you, Thomas, for this thought-provoking lecture. I will invite Alessandro Lupo as a discussant.
Thank you, Tom, for offering us this incredibly dense key lecture and for doing the effort of presenting us a topic that is very domestic for us. No? You chose Catholic frame, you chose a practice that we have witnessed, even in this faculty, we had a thesis, PhD thesis on the topic, trying to do fieldwork on the very same performance. And thank you for showing us how in the present world, the apparently rigid attitude and doctrinal frame of the church is able to adapt and to have dialogue with other disciplines like psychiatry. I cannot forget, I was telling you before during lunch that I taught for a decade, more or less, in a pontifical university here in Rome. And I attended once, about 15, 20 years ago, no, maybe 20 years ago, to a congress in the Pontifical Urbaniana University where both exorcists and psychiatrists were discussing about demonic possession, as if they were discussing experimental truth that could be experienced by witnesses like ethnographers. So you tried to show us how important it is to have a wide conscience, a wide concept of the meaning of trance, of how different can be the way its manifestations develop in the different contexts, and how the very ritual, which within the Catholic Church is very strictly conceived and normed, can still have a flexibility to adapt to different cases, to different issues, to different patients and possessed people. The history of possession is very ancient, but when we talk about possession, we obviously have to take into account that the entities, that the beings that are supposed to possess the conscience of subjects enormously vary according to the different cultural contexts and the different ontologies and cosmologies. So as cultures, ontologies and cosmologies transform themselves through space and time, obviously no rigid, stiff system can endure. We remind, you were quoting a Jesuit stating the presence, the active presence, but in symbolic terms of the devil in our society. Those of us who are old enough can remember the enormous echo that the words of Pope Paul VI had in the 70s when he said in front of the raising of terrorism and forms of violence that were not familiar to our society, he stated that the devil was present in our society and was walking through our social milieu. And it was considered a totally anachronistic statement that was sort of way laughed at. But obviously it had to be taken more seriously than it appeared. And as you also stressed, and I find it very interesting, as there are priests and Catholic authorities that have accepted the psychological, psychiatric, and psychoanalytical explanation of mental phenomena of different states of consciousness, also physicians, also members of a knowledge that is supposed to be lay, secularized, and rational, still can recognize themselves as part of the community of the parishioners and of believers. And so they can have a kind of dialogue which is not stubbornly exclusive in the out position of different truths that are opposed and cannot combine, but that is rather inclusive and that can permit the dialogue and the coexistence of the two points of view. Your evidence also shows us, from my point of view I cannot say if I am an ex-Catholic. I was trained as a Catholic boy. I did all my training. Then I became an anthropologist, and it became really difficult for me to keep acting within the church. But doing fieldwork in Mexico, it occurs to me to follow ritual in Catholic context and to be a witness of what maybe I do not perceive and live anymore as myself, but of the efficacy of the involvement of people who have faith into rituals. And having had a long acquaintance with priests and actors of different levels within the Catholic Church, we can also, as ethnologists, as professionals of contextualization, I think that we are anthropologists, but most of our theories, most of our new concepts, most of the innovative perspectives that we can develop, they don't arise simply from an abstract thought. They almost always come out of our ethnographic experience in specific contexts where the paradigms, the theories, the concepts that we try to apply to these concepts do not fit, are not useful for giving meaning and to letting us understand and explain what we see. So by delving into different contexts, into different religious contexts, into different Catholic contexts, we can also perceive how differentiated, according to context, are the performers of one single institution, like the Catholic Church, that in different contexts, in different spaces, in different countries, towns, churches, perform different actions and develop different dialogues with their interlocutors. I was reminding, listening to your wonderful speech, how plastic is the way the exorcistic ritual is in teaching to the possessed person to fit into the paradigm of possession. I must quote an excellent ethnographic work of a colleague of ours living and working in Rome called Adelina Talamonti, who many years ago wrote a book published by Liguori called La carne convulsiva, the convulsive flesh. He did a long fieldwork for her doctorate with Padre Amort, who was the most authoritative exorcist in Rome. And through her ethnography, many occasions, many seances of exorcism with several patients, she could tell how through this intercourse, through this flexible action made of words, made of acts, made of the use of objects, sacred substances, symbols, the crucifix, the stola of the parson, and so on, the possessed person learned how to be possessed, learned how to embody a paradigm and to, in a certain way, express in a therapeutic way the interpretive frame that explained the unease, the loss of self-control in a possessive way. Just as it is a different European non-demonic form of possession, but just like the poor women of the Salento that De Martino studied learned to move their bodies and to express the presence of the spider's poison within their bodies, a poison that in a certain way possessed them and substituted their presence, their self-consciousness in a typically local characteristic way. You quoted a person who said, "It is not me who perform these acts. It is not me who am enraged. My rage, my anger is that of the demon." And at the same time, she can distinguish, I don't remember if it was a she, it was a she, between her anger and the demon's anger. This recognition by the observer that actors can have different levels of awareness, can be driven by some other will, like the demon's one or like the spider's one, and at the same time be aware that there is some agency leading them, is one of the evidences that any ethnographer who has done fieldwork in context, native context, where trance or forms of possession occur, that distinguishes the, let's say, savant point of view of the scholar from the lay person. When we talk about possession, trance, and so on, to lay people, we normally have to contrast the naive point of view of those who, to say it in Italian, either they are or they act. Ci fanno o ci sono. You cannot have both. Either they act and they consciously show to be possessed, but they control their possession, or they are possessed. And so they are not treacherous people who lie. No, reality is much more complicated, and even conscience has very different levels. This morning, Francesca was telling us about the difference of being conscious that her body was moving forward or backward without her having the body to do those acts. No? We can be with, I remember one of the first experiences I had when I was a child was that of dreaming that I was falling from my bedroom in the street. And I was seeing myself from the street as if I was a witness, as if I was a camera in the street, seeing myself falling. The first time I dreamt that dream, I fell, and when I hit my buttocks on the floor, I woke. I dreamt that dream 3 times in my memory. But the second time I dreamt, I remember saying, it's the same dream. I must not be scared, because now I will hit my button and awake. So even while dreaming, I had different levels of conscience. I was dreaming and I was knowing that I was dreaming. And how often, by asking to our fellow possessed interlocutors, I would not call them informants, we have had witnesses of this kind. And I wanted to ask Tom Csordas another aspect, because one of the characteristics that are so persistent in the symbolic frame of Catholicism is that demonic possession, satanic possession, because we have different words in Italian. We have devils and we have demons. Demons are a much more neutral term. In Catholicism, they define devils, but in our ancient pagan terminology, demons are not necessarily ontologically bad. They can be, as you said, ambivalent. They can be ambiguous. They're maybe not divine, of a lower status, but they're non-human, extra-human entities that can be either familiar and benevolent or malevolent and aggressive. But the Catholic theology stressed that all manifestation that is not orthodox is demonic, is devilish, is evil. This is the doctrine. Then the practice tells us that things are much more complex and much more nuanced. And what I was going to ask, excuse me if I'm being a little prolix, but I want to explain it within the Catholic doctrinal frame. One of the characteristics that are so, in a certain way, sinister and oppressive of Catholic faith is its excessive seriousness. And when we talk about possession being demonic must be a tragic thing. We can think about films like The Exorcist or so on, which are horror films. But watching, and this is one of the questions I wanted to ask to Leora this morning, then we had no time, I do it now. The Korean shamanism, those forms of possession, I was wondering, is there some space for humor when spirits go crazy, when spirits become non-normatively proper? Can there be comics? Can there be humor? Can there be some form of transgression that provokes laughter? Why do I ask this? Because I was not a witness myself, but I had a student who did 2 stages of fieldwork among the Yaqui shamans, let's call them, the Yaqui healers of northern Mexico. She did go there, and she stayed there, and she met living shamans that could be touched in their flesh, much more than Don Juan, the Castaneda hero. I don't deny that he ever existed, but most of what Castaneda quotes among guillemets is his fancy invention. Federica was present in the seances of trance of a lady shaman, and she incorporated gypsy spirits from Europe or Indian spirits from India. Indians not in the sense of Indios, but from Southern Asia. And in some occasions, I remember that she was not enough acquainted with Mexican culture. I don't know how much you are acquainted with it, but in Mexican popular culture, not Indian culture, mestizo culture, there is a verbal form of joke, pun, kidding, that is called albur. It is an Arab word that defines forms of verbal competition among speakers whose topic is eros, is love, either in the sexual or in the more widely erotic sense. In Mexico, albur is pulling someone's leg, trying to fuck him or her, using double meanings, using grimaces, using sounds and other. And in a moment of the trance, of the curing seance, where the she shaman was possessed, and in this case, she was totally unconscious of what the spirit within her said, so that the witnesses, come si dice registrare, recorded with a cellular phone what she said, and the next day they let her listen to what the spirit within her said. But there was a very, for me, incredibly interesting piece of comedy with her husband being a sort of servant within the seance. The spirit within her was conscious of her husband's presence, obviously not the husband of the spirit, but the husband of the host, of the shaman. And the she shaman was saying a lot of albures about licking or sucking or other things towards her husband, and all of the ocean bursted laughing, and Federica couldn't understand why they were laughing. And when she gave me the transcription, I said, but didn't you understand that she was pulling his leg by evoking some acts of oral sex of this man with the spirit? And I said, how interesting is the role that humor can have in a therapeutic setting in possession. So I'm wondering, is there some space for humor within Catholic exorcism? Are nowadays demons within this new modern form of more dialogic Catholicism that can accept diagnostic categories that are taken out of DSM-5, 6, and so on? does it allow for other more popular forms? We know that in our popular Catholicism in the countryside, where priests were saying they're still pagan, Catholicism during Holy Week, for example, put into the scenario forms of eros, of very explicit sexual acts that were a way of expressing the, Victor Turner would say, anti-structure of those moments of the Holy Week when the devil rules, when there is the eclipse of the sunny godly power. There is darkness, there is the devil, but there is also humor. There is also a comic anti-structure. Is there any space for it? You have witnessed so many occasions of therapeutic possession. But when I saw something alive from North American or European Pentecostal rites, everything seems so serious, so sinister. Other spaces for different ways of living in a joyful way, the liberation that these forms of embodiment can allow. No, I believe that in native Mexico, this is very evident. The fact that the persons are aware that they can pray in some moments, then when the demon overwhelms them, they are not allowed to, but they are conscious of this obstacle, and then they acquire in a different moment of relief again the possibility to pray. I cannot forget that when I was discussing about the many egos that are conceived in the traditional Nahuatl ontology, the Nahuatl speaker Indians or native Mexicans that I work with since 1984 have an idea of the person that presupposes that at the moment when one is born, many animal souls are born. In some cases, they're not animals, they're thunders, they're atmospheric phenomena, but in any case, we are plural since the moment we're born. For example, they stated that as when I entered a house or a garden, the dogs ran barking at me with a very violent attitude. They interpreted this odd behavior of the dogs, which was more aggressive than with their neighbors. They supposed that the dogs saw the animal I was, as if the animals see your animal shape. We humans, it's like Viveiros de Castro's perspectivismo, no? We see each other in human forms, but animals see us in animal form. And so they saw that I was a possum. I was a tlacuache, which is the predator of normal houses. And so a person said to me, we do many bad things. We perform many crimes. We rape, we beat, we hit, we kill, we steal. But it is not us who do that. It is our animal alter egos who oblige us to do this, who compel us to do this. This means that they had a theory, not about the unconscious, about the ego, the superego, the S. They did not have a Freudian conception of the ego, but they were conscious of the multiplicity of the personalities that live within one same person, soul, mind complex. And this is something that many people experience in different contexts, and this is very interesting in what you said. When you mentioned an intercorporeal milieu, you defined in a marvelous way the very effective performing setting where the bodies of the ritualists and the bodies of the patients' clients interact in a very deep and culturally shaped way, no? But it only occurs within specific ritual contexts, which is very, very interesting. So I think I have said too many things maybe, and I don't want to forbid the public to ask their own questions. I hope to have given some ideas that can be added to what suggestion Thomas Csordas inspired in me, but he certainly have inspired in you many other questions, many other ideas, many other reflections. So please go on, and if you can, from the public here, approach and speak in this microphone, or if you're at home, open your microphone and ask your questions. Emily, please come back to handle the session. And I don't know if you want to give the microphone to other people, or if Tom wants to say something about what I said. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Are there any questions? I saw a question by Sydney Greenfield about the study of brainwaves in possessed people. I might suggest to have a look at Stanley Krippner's study called Mysterious Mind. The book is called Mysterious Mind, the neurobiology of psychic mediums and healers, I think, if I'm not wrong. Any questions?
Hello, Sid. Turn your microphone on, Sydney. Sydney and I used to be colleagues in the same anthropology department.
Yeah, I should thank Tom. It's good to see you again. Stanley Krippner doesn't go into studies biological brain waves. And someone has just mentioned that there is someone who has done this, and I've asked them for contact material. But I think it would be very relevant to find out, if we can, whether someone in a state of possession, whether their brain waves change when they move from one state, or they come in and they go out. And this is true not just for the study that you did, Tom, but for, I think, everybody who deals with people who are going into trance possession, whatever we want to call it.
Well, that would be absolutely fascinating.
And
There was a priest named René Laurentin who did a study of people, I think, speaking in tongues with electrodes on their heads. And that was, I think, in the 60s or 70s. But I think that in my case it would be really virtually impossible to do that, because it was hard enough to get the priests to give me an interview.
Yeah.
It was, and then it was hard enough for at the second level, it was hard enough for the priests to give me contact with people who were possessed to interview. And then the third level was, actually getting to be present at any exorcism sessions, to be there sitting in the corner taking notes. And if I would have asked to plug people into any brainwave mechanism, it just, I know it wouldn't have happened. But it would be fascinating to get that sense.
Well, I did a study in the 60s of an Umbanda medium going receiving different spirits. And if I remember correctly, it was published in an Italian in a book that was published in Italy.
Did you get electrodes hooked up to the Dr. Fritz people?
No, unfortunately, we were only able to do it with an Umbanda medium because he was my godson.
Yeah.
So it takes a special situation.
Yeah, a very special situation of access. One thing I want to say is, to Alessandro, I'm really glad that you brought up Adelina Talamonte, because that's just an incredible ethnographer. She gave me a copy of her book when I was here about 10 years ago. And yeah. And it's a remarkable book. And she did a very deep study just with that one exorcist. And if you have to choose any exorcist, I guess Padre Amorto would be the one to go with. And he just died, I think, 2 years ago, 2 or 3 years ago. On the issue of humor, I didn't see enough, but I did get the sense that there was some humor, small degrees of humor that were just kind of moments that lightened the tension. If something kind of harmless happened during that was amusing, that happened during a session, I think people would chuckle and the lightness would lifted. But I think that there is also some degree of possible sense of humor among exorcists themselves, not necessarily within the session of exorcism, but in terms of their trying to not make light of what they're doing, but again, find some kind of sense of relief for the seriousness of it. And it's of the kind that one prominent exorcist I interviewed at a Catholic university, and he invited me for lunch at the faculty club, and he said, we have to have dessert because they have really good dessert here, the dolce after the lunch, and they had a buffet with a table set out, and I said, okay, well, let's do this. And I picked a piece of chocolate cake, which, is sometimes called devil's food cake. And I said to the priest, so I hope it's okay if I take some of this devil's food cake. And he said, no, not at all. And he reached for a piece of cake that was a pure white cake with white frosting on the top, which sometimes is called angel food's cake. Right. And so his response was, no, it's not a problem at all. But he made sure that he took the opposite cake. And that's the kind of humor I think that, it's allowed. Yeah, that's allowed and probably expected. Yeah. But I would be interested in hearing about the Korean case as well as whether there's humor among Korean shamans.
Well, I'll say something about the humor and I'll ask you a question. Yeah, a lot of humor. I didn't talk about it. Not just humor, also sexuality, hints of sexuality. We talked about animal sacrifice, but one of the other things that important men of the past, powerful men liked was the sexual abuse of women. So oftentimes the shamans, that's in Korean tradition and myth, so oftentimes the possessed shaman would come to a woman in the audience and kind of, touch her or do things. They don't do it very rudely, but kind of suggesting that that's what the spirit is asking them to do. So yeah, and it would be playful. It wouldn't be harmful. Or at least that's how the audience laughed, like you said. But I think it's only possible, and that's my question too. I think that would be possible when the spirit, like you mentioned, are not mean by definition. They're not evil, because they can potentially harm you or help you. It depends if they're happy or not. But it seems that the demons here are always harmful. So I was thinking maybe there is a discussion in Catholicism, and I really don't know much about getting possessed by the Holy Spirit. Or I know in Pentecostal religion you do have that, right? In Pentecostal Christianity, you get the Spirit descend. Do you have something like that in Catholicism, like being possessed by God or some good or angels or some good entities? And how would that be different than exorcism? Because you don't need to exorcise, right? That's my question.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks. So that's an interesting question. So in this is about possession by the Holy Spirit, and the issue of Pentecostalism is relevant. Now there's Protestant Pentecostalism, and there's Catholic Pentecostalism, or the charismatic renewal, right? So in Protestant Pentecostalism, there's the idea that one can be possessed by the Holy Spirit, and the Holy Spirit possessing you causes you to speak in tongues. Now, when the Catholics picked up those Pentecostal ideas and created Catholic Pentecostalism, which eventually became known as the charismatic renewal, they reinterpreted this, the idea of the baptism of the Holy Spirit and the Holy Spirit coming upon you. The Catholic Pentecostals did not have the idea that one became possessed by the Holy Spirit. Catholic Pentecostals say that the Holy Spirit is already within you because you have the sacrament of confirmation. And so the baptism of the Holy Spirit is not the Holy Spirit possessing you, but it's releasing the Holy Spirit that's already there. And the Holy Spirit does not cause one to go into trance and speak in tongues, but the Holy Spirit gives gifts of the Spirit. And one of those gifts is the gift of being able to speak in tongues consciously as a form of prayer. So those are really phenomenological distinctions that the Catholic Pentecostals who started the charismatic renewal, who are like graduate students and junior faculty in Catholic universities, reinterpreted the phenomenology to be compatible with Catholicism. And that's how that came about. The issue of, and I have to touch on this because you opened the door to it, the ontological turn with Vivero de Castro and all that. One of the kind of my less mature responses to that in the face of this work is, well, why do we have to pay so much attention to Amazonian and Melanesian ontology when we can look at this right here? This what's happening in the Catholic Church, the enchantment of Western civilization. All those ontological issues are already here, and it's important to recognize them. But it's not as if these discoveries from Melanesian and Amazonian ethnography are going to tell us something new that's not already here. What they can help us, though, is to look over our shoulder, and make let's say, an ontological twist towards seeing these same issues in our own, our own society right now, So that's a comment with respect to that part of the issue. Maybe any other questions?
There are questions online from Bono Lee. I have two questions. Does demonic possession only occur in a group setting, example, exorcism, rather than when the possessed person is alone? If so, is demonic possession a social performance rather than a psychopathology per se, and the possessed person a certain degree of agency and awareness? 2. If there is a loss of agency and awareness during possession, how can this be explained from the mind-body unity from a phenomenological perspective? And I would also ask this by Santiago Lopez Pavillar. Can possession be considered a shamanic state of consciousness? Can healing be seen as a kind of exorcism?
So I would distinguish between the kind of consciousness and possession, like demonic possession, from shamanic kind of consciousness. I don't want to collapse all these different altered states of consciousness into the same category. They have certain things in common, but ethnographically they're very distinct. I think that there is, without making a mind-body dualism, I want to recognize that, you know, mind-body dualism is kind of like an empirical phenomenon. It shouldn't be an analytic category. I mean, the fact that we can, and sometimes do in everyday life, distinguish between mind and body is just a description of our everyday experience. We're not the only society or only culture that makes those kinds of distinction. What I would reiterate is that in terms of the very structure of our embodiment, there is this element of alterity that I referred to, you know, that you know, we can touch ourselves, right? And I can feel myself touching me, and I can feel myself being touched at the same time. And those are two different things. You know, I'm both a subject touching and an object being touched at the same time. And I think that structure of embodiment in itself, the alterity that's structured into our embodiment, is the little crack in our existence that then gets elaborated into all the grand alterities of otherness. You know, the awesomeness that Gerardus van der Loof talked about. You know, there is always the possibility of splitting. That doesn't necessarily require us to use duality as an analytic necessity, right? And what was the other part of that?
There is loss of agency and awareness during possession, and this will explain mind body unity.
Yeah, I think that's what I was just talking about. Yeah.
Is the possession occur in a setting rather than when possessed person?
Yes, the social setting of it. So, okay, in this Catholic situation, a person who is possessed, every now and then they'll experience something in everyday life, but more or less their everyday life, they can go about their business. Sometimes they're able to hold a job. Sometimes they're able to live in their families. But it becomes most pronounced in the actual settings of exorcism, right? It's like, it's an incubator of demonic manifestations. And the demon is challenged, and the priest, you know, the demon expects to be able to become present, and the people who are participating in this intercorporeal milieu expect the demon to reveal itself, and so, you know, that is likely to happen. That's and the situations that I was talking about of trance in this talk were specifically geared to the ritual performance, the actual session of exorcism. So the person is understood to be possessed kind of all the time, but is not necessarily manifesting the demon or in trance or anything else, unless they're in the ceremony. So it's a social thing, and the exorcism is supposed to be resulting in a person being free, liberated, is what they'll say, and then be able to testify to it, witness it, and not only go back to being a very devout Catholic, but also being living proof that exorcism is real and it works. And that's where it plugs into being not on the level of individual therapy or therapeutic process, but on the ideological level of consolidating patriarchal authority over the faithful.
Thank you. When you say that the demons are telling us about the people as well, I recall like this shared imagery. For example, you mentioned feeling being touched and touching, how they coexist. And also Alessandro mentioned this different level of consciousness in dreams. I also can make a parallel with my interlocutors, mediums in Brazil, how they feel, they can describe, they have these visions, inner visions of their spirits according to bodily feelings. It's like having an image of yourself by drawing the attention towards your inner feelings. So how these imagery is constructed but also shared. So in this case, the demon, in other case, it could be a preto velho in a Brazilian, Afro-Brazilian religion, spiritism. But how are these shared? So how they're learned in this sense. And now this learning, this shared imagery, starting from bodily feeling, from embodied knowledge, can be therapeutic. And so moving a step forward towards this shared collective imagery, which is constructed starting from this embodied knowledge.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the possibility of any bodily experience being interpreted in a particular way is what we're talking about. If I yawn like that, right? We all know that yawns are contagious, right? So if I yawn, someone else might. But my yawn is not an intentional act, right? It's a spontaneous act. Okay. Well, then one asks the question, did I do that? And in what sense did I do that? You know, and what are the conditions in the interpretations of that? Well, one interpretation is that the demon did it, or maybe it yawned, and that's especially likely to be the case if it's in the session of exorcism, or if somebody is at home who's possessed and they're trying to pray and suddenly they're interfered with their praying because they're suddenly yawning, you know, or burping or something like that, right? Then that's an interpretation of it, and then you can say, well, does yawning spontaneously is there a sense that can be interpreted as kind of being in a trance, because you know you didn't do it on purpose, but it was kind of there in your milieu. And I think yawning is a really good example, because it's not only contagious, but it can happen not only when you're sleepy. I mean, sometimes I yawn when I'm nervous, right? When I'm anxious about something. You know, I don't feel sleepy, but I'll still yawn. So there's this, you know, spontaneous thing that it's related to the touching and the touching. It's something that's you're doing, but you are not doing. And put in a particular cultural context, it's going to be interpreted in a different kind of way. And the cultural context is absolutely critical for the interpretation, you know, because in what context is something interpreted as a demonic manifestation? What's the cultural background for that, right? Well, this is part of the reason when, you know, I did my research on exorcism in Italy, I made sure that I was doing it in northern Italy, because just like we in the States, we have the idea that people in the South are backwards and superstitious. I happen to know that same thing is here in Italy. People in the South are backwards and superstitious. So I'm going to do my research in the North, you know, so that, you know, everybody doesn't say, okay, well, Csordas is just kind of, everybody knows from Di Martino that, you know, that this is. So the cultural context is critical on how you're going to interpret it. And it's also part of why I wanted to do this study as a comparative study between Italy and the United States, right? Between a country where 95% of the people are Catholic and another country where only 20% of the people are Catholic. And those people are made of all different kinds of ethnic, you know, Irish Catholic, Italian Catholic, French Catholic, German Catholic. So there's a difference in the way the cultural context for the understanding of what's happening, right, in these things. And I had some ideas at the beginning of what I was going to find. You know, I thought that I was going to find that in the States, when people were possessed and exorcism was taken into account, there wasn't going to be any reference to curses. Whereas in Italy, there was going to be all kinds of stuff about fattura and, you know, cursing being involved in it. And that may be somewhat relatively the case, but then I found out that there was more talk about curses in the United States than I expected. So that hypothesis is not that robust. But these all have to do with the cultural context of how these phenomena are interpreted and how they're taken up into the discourse. You know, a discourse on the one hand of therapy and affliction, on the other hand, a discourse into, you know, hegemonic patriarchy.
Thank you. Are there other questions? Could you come here, please?
Hello, thank you. I just have two little questions, and one is thinking of Di Martino. So if you notice that the exorcisms were ritualized in any way, as if they happened in a specific time of life or something that was repeated, and if the people who went to an exorcism, besides a demonic behavior, if there was like an exorcist behavior they could expect and maybe feel comforted by. And the second question is just if it's possible for an exorcism not to work, or if it's like a miracle and it has to work. Thank you.
So you know, there's a famous article by Arthur Kleinman about how ritual healing must work because of the way it's defined. But it's clear in this case of exorcism that it doesn't have to work and it doesn't always work. And even in the case that I read from the psychiatrist in my talk, right, that there was the one woman who kind of suspended her exorcism, you know, and maybe would come back to it later. Well, I'm sure she probably never would, because they don't always succeed. And not only do they not always succeed, but they don't happen just once. People are sometimes in the process of exorcism for years, literally years. And that way it's kind of like psychoanalysis, you know, it's a process, well, not like psychoanalysis, but you know, they're going through a process that lasts for a long time. in terms of the kind of people in the stage of life, the most obvious and glaring thing is that it's mostly women. Now, this is the case. This is the case across many religions. You know, it's a lot in terms of possession cults and things like the Tsar cult and you know, Candomblé and cults like that. It's predominantly women. Okay, so I can't say that Catholic exorcism is unique in that sense, but it does have the dynamics that, you know, every time I ask an exorcist, they typically say 75 to 80% of their cases are women. And when you put that together with the fact that 100% of exorcists are men, right? Because they have to be priests, Catholic priests, you get something that's, you know, that's where it's the most obvious that this is patriarchal institution, confirming itself. But so I've also, you know, in a couple of the cases that I have who are men, who are males, you know, I've tried to ask, okay, so what about these male people who are possessed? You know, how does that play into the patriarchy? And how does that support the patriarchy? And I'm still working through that idea. Well, for example, the male example that I gave, who is very self-aware of everything that's happening to him during the possession. There's something male and patriarchy affirming about just that in itself. And you should hear the way he talks about his wife. But I won't get into that part of it now. But his marriage is very strife filled, and he's got patriarchal issues there as well. So, and and the other male that I interviewed was a younger guy, a guy in his 20s. So it can be anywhere in the lifespan. That's also part of your question. But the young guy was part of an immigrant family whose father had been an immigrant and was descended from a line of Buddhist priests. And because he was from pagan background, his family regarded him as not able to fully fulfill the role of a father as protector and spiritual protector of his family. Okay, so those two examples of males who were possessed, I think, actually do support, you know, the logic of exorcism as a patriarchal discourse.
Hi, thanks. It was such a fascinating presentation and loads of things I wanted to ask about, but I was really fascinated about the meetings between the psychiatrists and the priests and those kind of discourses that went on there. Because there's a key theme around intentionality, like you said, and there was this fear that mental illness could be counterfeiting. It was demon possession that was kind of hidden by mental illness. And I wondered if, because that assumes that the mental illness there's a real thing called mental illness. And were there debates around the veracity of psychiatric disorders? And could the inverse also be true, that, the demon possession was a kind of fakery? So I just wondered if those debates were brought up around the fact that these scientific concepts themselves are also subject to some debate and questions around veracity and authenticity and of course agency, like the extent to which, hysteria is completely involuntary.
Yeah.
Sorry, look.
No, that's a really good one. So, the so two pieces of anecdotal evidence, as it were. One of the psychiatrists that I interviewed, the chair of his psychiatry department was also a Catholic, and had written an article in a Catholic magazine about, in which he said that exorcism is kind of the standard line, exorcism is something that's kind of anachronistic, and we now know that, it's schizophrenia or epilepsy and stuff. And so this psychiatrist, he's got a, how am I going to challenge my boss, right? So he wrote a piece that I don't know whether he published it, but he sent it as a letter to his boss saying, I agree with everything you said, except for the fact that demons are ontological entities. And I distinctly remember that phrase, because the ontological entities, that's what he used. And so you have this level of dealing with mental illness. So you have the stereotypical psychiatrist who's an atheist, and and then you have the Catholic psychiatrist who's a practicing psychiatrist who's likely to write that article saying that it's anachronistic. And then you have the kind of Catholic psychiatrist who's actively collaborating, right? Because we're talking about, this meeting is about collaborating, right? In maybe in other senses, who are part of the phenomenon, who are collaborating there. And I find this fascinating, that you have these different epistemological, ontological levels among scientists who then do say, right, and you've encountered these folks, Alessandro, and years ago in your meeting, they are discussing this as empirical reality, right? These are empirical observations, and that's the psychiatrist that I was talking about. Use this to an objective observer like me. This is a real possession, and he's thinking in scientific terms. The other anecdotal thing is that Janice is very annoyed with me that I didn't do skids with these people, right? The structured clinical interview for DSM, she said, how can you talk about psychiatric illness of not if you're interviewing these people without doing an actual psychiatric diagnostic evaluation with them? And my answer is always it's my same answer that I gave Sid. I don't think that they would let me do a psychiatric evaluation of them any more than they would let me put electrodes on their heads, especially because some of them just reject the problem that they have, reject the idea that they have anything wrong with them other than being possessed. While yet others will say, yes, I'm possessed, but I'm also in therapy, and I take psychopharmaceutical drugs too, because I have these diagnoses. And so, I've emphasized the ethnographic part of it. How are they defining mental illness in relationship to possession? And by doing that, I think I'm also avoiding the issue of having to be in a position of saying, okay, well, they say they're possessed, but I've done the skid, and so this is what's really wrong with them from it. And so by not doing the skid, I'm sidestepping that issue.
I just like, so it was like when you were talking about the touch on, alterity and elements, I think that made me think that the real part is to go into that alterity and never to come back, right? To not be able to come back. Whereas the exercise, you come back, right? So that to me is that's perhaps the real madness, is that you go there and you really cannot come back. You are lost. I think that's like a deep fear.
there was one exorcist who said that there was one guy that he encountered, a man that he encountered, where he didn't go through with the exorcism because the guy had developed such a symbiotic relationship with the demon that it probably would have done more damage to exorcise him than it would. I only heard that one time from one exorcist, right? Which I thought was really quite remarkable.
Okay, if there aren't any other questions, I would like to thank Tom for this fascinating lecture. And I hope to see you all tomorrow for a very rich program of sessions on endogenous processes, mental health. We also have a Heal Network, a workshop with practitioners of healing, and finally the book launch of Other Worlds, Other Bodies, Embodied Epistemologies and Ethnographies of Healing. So see you tomorrow. Thank you very much for joining us today.